So the big difference is, and it's 1 standard deviation, so to be as interested in things as the typical man, the typical woman would have to be more interested in things than 85% of women. And to be more interested in people than things, to be as interested in people as the typical woman, a man would have to be more interested in people than 85% of men. Now that's starting to become a very large difference. Now there's other differences too. This is using the Holland categories. Holland is a very well-renowned industrial organizational psychologist, and he divided jobs into these 6 categories: realistic, investigative, artistic, social, enterprising, and conventional. And what you see is that men show stronger realistic and investigative interests. The realistic category is particularly big, it's 0.8 of a standard deviation, and women show strong artistic, social, and conventional interests. And there was no sex, no gender difference at all in the degree to which people preferred enterprising occupations. So here's from a different study from Psychological Bulletin, looking at there's this phenomena that people are quite upset about, especially in the US, although it's also an issue in Germany, that women are underrepresented in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics dimensions. And so, but if you look at the interests of men and women, you see under men that men are 1.1 standard deviation more likely to be interested in engineering, and 4/10 of a standard deviation to be more interested in science, and 3/10 of a standard deviation more interested in math. Now that has nothing to do with ability. So, you know, there is some evidence, although it's really highly disputed, and the evidence I think keeps going back and forth, that men are better at spatial rotation, and that seems to be linked to testosterone. But like I said, this idea has been attacked very heavily. There's also some evidence that if you look at the intelligence distribution of men and women, that the women's distribution is a little higher peaked and a little less wide. And what that means is there's far more men who fall into the extremely intellectually impaired category, and that sort of seems to go along with the fact that the vast proportion of children in school who are in trouble are boys, but they're also overrepresented at the extreme upper end of the continuum, so the male distribution is flattened, and the people who believe that, well, it's typical in animal communities, mammalian communities, for there to be more variability among the men. So, because men are expendable fundamentally, and so in some sense the species can take a bigger chance with variability, even though the means remain the same. Now, that was what Larry Summers was referring to. He was a president of Harvard, when he suggested that there might be intellectual differences between men and women that in part accounted for the differences in STEM prevalence. And he just got roasted for that. In fact, I think they fired him, which was really unfair, I thought, because he was just referring to a study. He wasn't making a claim that that was his opinion. But we can put that aside for the time being. It doesn't look like you need to invoke an intellectual capacity explanation to account for the underrepresentation. You can just see that the interests diverge. Now, you know, you could attribute that to stereotypes and so forth, but then you run up against the problem that the differences are bigger in the countries that have done the most to eradicate the stereotypes. So I don't really see how that hypothesis can survive. As far as I'm concerned, it's just been proved wrong in the last 10 years. The gender differences are not primarily cultural. So then you see this underrepresentation here. Completing degree in employment in math, 50% fewer women in math, 40% in the physical sciences, 25% in computer science, and 25% in engineering. So here's other occupational differences that are quite extreme. And there's other reasons for these. I don't think that these are only interest related. So let's say, what are differences between men and women? Obvious ones, right? There's the primary and secondary sexual characteristics. What else is different?
Reproduction.
Okay.
So then these jobs require they're more dangerous kind of jobs, hence men
Yes, well that goes along with the sort of male expendability issue, right? So yeah, they are more dangerous jobs, and the probability that a man will be killed at work is extraordinarily higher than the probability that a woman will be killed at work. So, what other differences are there between men and women?
Men are larger and stronger.
Yeah, they're about 4 inches taller. They're not as much heavier as you would think. I thought it was bigger than this. I'll show you. 164 versus 194. Those are the American averages. So here's differences between men and women. The gender differences, these sort of physiological gender differences, the psychological gender differences to some degree too, can be lumped under a biological category called sexual dimorphism. And in some animals, sexual dimorphism is how much difference there is in the morphology between a male of the species and a female of the species. And there can be a lot, like with elephant seals, for example, the males are like 10 times bigger than the females. And usually in a situation like that, the male has a harem. So there's extreme male reproductive success on the part of a couple of males, and then extreme male failure among the rest of them. So there seems to be some relationship between lack of sexual dimorphism and monogamy among mammals. So the less dimorphic a species is, the more likely they are to pair bond. And human beings are relatively non-dimorphic. So we're a little more dimorphic than the typical monogamous animal, but a little less dimorphic than the typical polygamous animal. And gender differences, these sorts of gender differences, with the male being larger and more aggressive than the female, are not characteristic of all mammals, although they're characteristic of many of them. So the major exception are hyenas. And the hyena females are very testosteronized, and they're very, if that's a word, they're very much, they have very high levels of testosterone, and they're slightly larger than the males, and they are more aggressive. But the price they pay for that is that their reproductive organs mimic the penis, and that's what they have to give birth through. So it isn't exactly clear that that's I'm not sure that's an advantage. Okay, well, so here are some of the differences between men and women. So you can see there's a 5-inch difference in height, a 30-pound difference in weight. Men are about 40 to 60% stronger in their upper body, and about 70 to 75, sorry, that's wrong. Women are 40 to 60% as strong as men in upper body strength, and 70 to 75% in terms of lower body strength. Men have thicker jaws, heavier jaws. Women who are ovulating prefer men with thicker jaws. So for example, if you show women pictures of the same men across their menstrual cycle, and all you do is widen the jaw, the narrow-jawed guy is more preferable when there's less probability of conception, and the wider-jawed guy is more desirable when the probability of ovulation is high. And jaw dimensions are associated, at least to some degree, with aggression. Why would that be? Why would that be? Because it's for biting. You know, like think about animals, they bite, you know, and human beings can bite too. So the jaw, the relationship between jaw dimension and disagreeableness, say, seems to have, it's a somewhat of a hangover from our evolutionary past. Women have a higher proportion of body fat. Women are more resistant to diseases. That's a good deal for women. They live longer. That's a good deal too. There's way more male homicide victims, which seems spectacularly unfair until you notice that there are many more male homicide perpetrators, which then seems to sort of even things out. Men kill non-intimate acquaintances or strangers 80% of the time, where women kill intimate partners or family members 60% of the time. Of course, they're doing it a lot less frequently. So, and you never know how many of those are in something approximating desperation and self-defense, right? Excluding the odd psychopathic woman. So